Have you ever wondered why maintaining a friendship at 30 feels infinitely more complex than it did at 15? Why that natural ease of connecting with someone during a school break has transformed into an elaborate dance of schedules, expectations, and social masks? Maybe you have hundreds of friends on Instagram, but when you need someone for a genuine conversation at 2 a.m., that list shrinks dramatically. Or perhaps you look at your current friendships and ask yourself, do these people really know me? Or do they only know the edited version of myself I choose to show? The truth is that the difficulty in maintaining adult friendships reveals something much deeper about human nature and the process of psychological development. And once you understand this mechanism, you'll never look at your relationships the same way again. If this resonates with you, you're definitely not alone. This happens to virtually everyone transitioning into adulthood, but most people simply accept it as, that's just how life is, without realizing there's actual depth psychology behind it. What's fascinating is that your psyche is following specific, predictable patterns during these relational experiences. Here's what's really happening. Your adult mind has been conditioned to navigate relationships through increasingly complex filters of social expectations, professional roles, and psychological defenses. This creates an emotional distance that feels isolating and confusing, but it's actually following developmental rules that were established through years of socialization. Most people go their entire lives experiencing this relational pattern without understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface. They think it's just growing up or people changing, when it's actually a fundamental shift in how the psyche organizes itself in relation to others. But once you see how this psychological architecture works, everything starts making sense. Today, we're going to explore exactly why adult friendships operate differently, not through self-help platitudes, but through the lens of what one of psychology's greatest minds discovered about human connection and authenticity. This isn't about quick fixes or friendship hacks. This is about understanding the deeper psychological forces that shape how we relate to others as we mature, and why the very process of becoming an individual adult creates specific challenges for maintaining genuine connections. Turns out, Carl Jung figured this out decades ago. He called it the tension between persona and individuation, basically the conflict between the social masks we wear and our authentic psychological development. Jung understood that as we mature psychologically, we inevitably develop what he termed a persona, the face we present to the world. But here's where it gets interesting. This persona, while necessary for functioning in society, actually creates barriers to the kind of spontaneous, unfiltered connection we experienced in childhood. Modern psychology confirms what Jung observed. The very process of psychological maturation that allows us to function as adults simultaneously complicates our capacity for simple, direct, emotional connection. Jung's insight goes deeper than most contemporary approaches, because he understood that this isn't a problem to be solved. It's an inherent tension in human psychological development. So when you experience difficulty maintaining adult friendships, here's the full psychological story unfolding. Your conscious mind identifies the desire for connection, but the moment this happens, your psychological defense system activates like a sophisticated filtering mechanism. Think of it like this. Your psyche has developed multiple layers of identity management. There's your professional self that networks strategically and maintains appropriate boundaries. There's your social self that curates experiences for optimal presentation. There's your family self that fulfills specific roles and expectations. And buried beneath all of these is what Jung called the authentic self, the part that actually craves genuine, unmediated connection. Your adult brain is essentially running a background program that says assess social risk before emotional investment. So every time you meet someone new or reconnect with an old friend, your psyche immediately begins calculating, what image should I project? What level of vulnerability is safe? How much of my real thoughts and struggles should I reveal? Here's what's really fascinating. This psychological architecture was installed gradually through years of social conditioning. Your psyche learned to treat authentic emotional expression as potentially dangerous to your social status, professional image, or relational security. Not because genuine connection actually threatens these things, but because somewhere along the way, you internalize the message that being too much or too real carries social consequences. I'm curious, have you noticed this filtering happening in your own relationship? Can you think of a specific moment when you caught yourself editing your authentic response to maintain a certain image? Your adult psyche is still running this same protective software. Every time you feel the impulse to be completely honest about your struggles, fears, or unconventional thoughts, the alarm goes off. This creates emotional distance, not because you're incapable of connection, but because you're unconsciously protecting something that got labeled as socially risky years ago. This explains why childhood friendships felt so effortless. Children haven't yet developed sophisticated persona management systems. They say what they think, feel what they feel, and connect based on immediate emotional resonance, rather than calculated social positioning. Now, this same psychological mechanism shows up in 5 specific ways that virtually everyone experiences. Each one follows the exact same persona protection pattern, just in different relational contexts. The performative friendship. Here's what's really happening when friendship becomes performative through social media and curated interactions. Your psyche treats authentic vulnerability like a potential threat to your social image. Your brain has somehow learned that showing struggle, confusion, or imperfection might damage your perceived social value. The psychological pattern. Social interaction triggers persona activation, curated presentation, surface-level connection. This is why scrolling through friends' highlight reels can feel emotionally draining, even when you rationally understand you're seeing edited versions. Your psyche is constantly measuring your unfiltered reality against their performed success, which creates a sense of relational inadequacy that's completely artificial. The time-depth paradox. When adult responsibilities consume your time and energy, here's the deeper psychological dynamic at play. Your mind has learned to categorize relationships as either productive or indulgent, creating internal conflict about investing time in seemingly unproductive emotional connection. Your psyche follows this logic. Limited time, efficiency prioritization, relational cost-benefit analysis, emotional distance. This explains why even when you have free time, reaching out to friends can feel psychologically difficult. It's not just about scheduling, it's about an internalized belief system that treats deep emotional investment as somehow less valuable than achievement-oriented activities. The vulnerability barrier. The fear of authentic emotional expression in adult friendships reveals a sophisticated psychological defense system. Your mind has learned to equate emotional honesty with potential rejection, abandonment, or social judgment, creating an unconscious cost-benefit analysis before any genuine sharing. The pattern, emotional impulse, risk assessment, self-censoring, protected but isolated connection. This is why you might find yourself saying, "I'm fine," when you're actually struggling, or sharing only the socially acceptable versions of your challenges. Your psyche has learned that vulnerability carries potential social costs, so it automatically filters your authentic experience through a safety screening process. The nostalgia trap. That wistful longing for the simple friendships of youth isn't just sentimentality. It's your psyche recognizing the psychological freedom you experienced before developing complex identity management systems. Your mind romanticizes past connections because they represent a time when your authentic self could emerge without sophisticated filtering. You're not just missing specific people, you're missing a version of yourself that could connect without calculation, share without strategy, and relate without constant self-monitoring. The psychological reality, current complexity, nostalgic idealization, present relationships feel inadequate, increased isolation. The digital connection paradox, the strange phenomenon of feeling lonely while being digitally connected to hundreds of people, reveals how technology amplifies the persona-authenticity split. Digital platforms are literally designed to reward persona performance over authentic expression. Your psyche experiences this contradiction: constant social input, decreased genuine intimacy, emotional hunger, more digital seeking, deeper dissatisfaction. Every like, comment, and share reinforces the persona-based connection model, while your authentic self remains hungry for unmediated emotional contact. You end up feeling simultaneously overconnected and profoundly alone. So, here's what's really interesting. All 5 of these manifestations follow the exact same psychological pattern that Jung identified. Your psyche has essentially split your relational capacity into socially acceptable and potentially risky categories. And unfortunately, most of your authentic emotional reality ended up in the risky category. Every single time a genuine connection opportunity arises, your mind runs the same program. This authentic response might threaten your social position. So you feel isolated for being human, basically. This isn't your personal failing, it's developmental. Somewhere in your transition to adulthood, you absorbed the message that certain aspects of your authentic self needed to be managed, controlled, or hidden to maintain social acceptance. The pattern is always the same: authentic impulse, social risk assessment, persona activation, protected but distant connection. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This protective strategy doesn't actually create the security it promises. When you consistently present a curated version of yourself, people end up relating to your persona rather than to your authentic self. The very strategy designed to protect your social connections actually prevents the deep intimacy you're craving. This insight about adult friendship usually surprises people because we're taught to think of emotional maturity as learning to be appropriate in social situations. But what if the opposite is true? What if our sophisticated social filtering is actually what creates the disconnection we're trying to avoid? I'm curious about your experience with this. Have you ever noticed that your closest friendships are with people who somehow bypass your usual social filtering? People around whom you can be more authentic without conscious effort. Understanding this pattern gives you a completely different relationship to your own relational struggles. Instead of being evidence that you're socially inadequate, your difficulty maintaining deep adult friendships becomes evidence that you're psychologically healthy enough to recognize the difference between surface-level social interaction and genuine human connection. Now that you understand this psychological architecture, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. When that familiar social anxiety hits, before reaching out to an old friend, you can think, oh, this is my persona protection system activating, instead of assuming there's something wrong with you or the friendship. When you feel reluctant to contact someone you genuinely care about, ask yourself, am I avoiding this interaction because of actual incompatibility, or because I'm unconsciously calculating social risks? Instead of, how do I maintain more friendships? Try asking, what parts of my authentic self am I unconsciously filtering in my relationships? What would happen if I shared one more layer of genuine experience? Jung suggested that psychological development naturally moves toward fewer but deeper connections. What if your difficulty maintaining numerous friendships isn't a social failure, but a sign of maturing relational needs? This shows up everywhere: in professional networking that feels hollow, in social gatherings where you feel lonely surrounded by people, in digital connections that leave you feeling empty. Same psychological blueprint, different settings. The goal isn't to eliminate your social awareness or persona completely. These serve important functions in society. The goal is to recognize when your protective filtering is preventing the authentic connection you're actually craving. You can acknowledge your social conditioning while making conscious choices about when to risk greater authenticity. When you catch yourself automatically filtering your response in a friendship, pause and ask, is this filtering protecting something real, or am I just running old programming about what's socially safe? Remember, the difficulty of adult friendship isn't a personal deficiency. It's a natural consequence of psychological development in a society that often rewards performance over authenticity. So here's what we've discovered today. The reason maintaining adult friendships feels so challenging isn't because you've become socially incompetent or because people are fundamentally selfish. It's because your psyche has developed sophisticated identity management systems that, while necessary for social functioning, create barriers to the kind of spontaneous, unfiltered connection you experienced before developing these psychological defenses. Your mind is running protective programming that says assess social risk before emotional investment. So every time you want to be genuinely authentic with someone, it triggers automatic filtering through the same 5 manifestations we explored. Authentic impulse, social risk assessment, persona activation, surface connection, emotional dissatisfaction. But now you can recognize this as psychological architecture rather than personal inadequacy. Whether it's performative social media connections, the time-depth paradox, vulnerability barriers, nostalgic idealization, or digital connection hunger, it's all the same mechanism. Your psyche learned years ago that certain aspects of authentic emotional expression were risky to your social belonging. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. That hesitation before calling an old friend suddenly makes psychological sense. That feeling of loneliness at social gatherings isn't mysterious anymore. That craving for deeper conversation has a clear developmental explanation. But here's the deeper question that Jung would want us to consider. What if the discomfort you feel about surface-level adult friendships is actually your authentic self calling you toward more genuine connection? What if your dissatisfaction with performative relationships is a sign of psychological health rather than social failure? This is just one example of how understanding the unconscious patterns that govern your emotional life can transform your relationship to your own experience. Instead of judging yourself for struggling with adult friendships, you can recognize this as evidence of a psyche that values authentic connection over social convenience. Carl Jung spent his career mapping these unconscious patterns because he understood that awareness is the first step towards psychological freedom. The bigger picture is that most of your relational struggles aren't evidence of personal defects. They're evidence of a healthy psyche, recognizing the difference between authentic and artificial connection. In a culture that often prioritizes networking over relating, productivity over presence, and performance over authenticity, your difficulty with surface-level adult friendships might actually be pointing you towards something more meaningful. If exploring the psychology behind human connection was valuable, subscribe for more investigations into the unconscious patterns that shape our emotional lives. There are so many psychological mechanisms hiding in everyday experience that make perfect sense once you understand the deeper dynamics. What unconscious pattern should we examine next? Maybe it's why creative work feels simultaneously essential and terrifying, or why success often brings unexpected emptiness, or why we sabotage the things we claim to want most. Share your thoughts on the psychological mysteries you've always wondered about. I read every comment and often build entire explorations around your insights. Remember, understanding these patterns doesn't instantly resolve the challenges, but it transforms your relationship to your own experience. And that changes everything. If you knew that your struggle with adult friendships was actually evidence of a psyche that refuses to settle for superficial connection, how might that change your relationship to the loneliness you sometimes feel?